Washington Journal continues.
And we are joined now by Richard Perle, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, former Assistant Defense Secretary. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us. This is the Weekly Standard. Wanted Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. And inside the most recent edition of the Weekly Standard is an open letter to the president that you took part in, and you wrote to endorse your admirable commitment to lead the world to victory in the war against terrorism. And you laid out a number of points here that need to be addressed. In your judgment, the steps outlined constitute the minimum necessary if this war is to be fought effectively. You begin with Osama bin Laden. Tell us what you think should be done right now.
Well, the main point about Osama bin Laden is that he has to be separated from the support that the sanctuary that he has in Afghanistan. Without it, he would be ineffective. The best way to deal with Osama bin Laden would be to find him and kill him, of course. That may not be possible, but if he becomes a fugitive, forced to live in caves, which he is not now, if he is on the run, he will be far less effective than, sadly, he has proven to be so far.
Now, you go on to broaden this campaign to talk about several other areas of interest. Iraq, you talk about. Tell us what you would like to see done there.
Well, clearly, Saddam Hussein has been supporting international terror. He was behind a plot to assassinate a former president of the United States. His intelligence apparatus is working with terror networks around the world. As long as he is in power, terrorists will have a place to hide, and they will have the support that he provides them. We have to be rid of Saddam Hussein once and for all. That regime must go, and that's what we argue in our letter.
How do you do it?
Well, there are a variety of ways. Like all dictators who rule as Saddam does, by fear and intimidation. He's made a great many enemies within his own country. There are a great many Iraqis who are willing to risk their lives to remove him from power. They deserve our support. The Congress has even voted funds for that purpose, but the last administration, and until now even this one, have been reluctant to make the commitment to the opposition to Saddam Hussein. I hope that will now change. There's no reason to delay further in getting behind the opposition. And I believe they can be effective, especially if we are prepared to support them with training, with equipment, and ultimately perhaps with precision bombing strikes that would support their activities on the ground.
We will put the phone numbers on the bottom of the screen for Richard Perle of the American Enterprise Institute. We'll take calls in just a couple minutes. Phone lines split regionally around the U.S. and an international line, of course. We just spent a full hour with Dr. Goldring at the University of Maryland, who explained that she pretty much mirrors the approach that Colin Powell would like to take. Diplomacy first. She talks about the U.S. using what she called its great economic and political tools and not military action. What's your response to that?
Well, of course we should be using political and economic tools. I don't know why anyone would rule out military action. We're dealing with people who have declared war in the most brutal way by attacking civilians. To exclude the use of our military capability, to destroy the bases from which they operate, to render them ineffective, seems to me totally unnecessary. And I don't believe that is Colin Powell's view, by the way. I've not heard the Secretary of State rule out the use of force. On the contrary, I believe our diplomacy is an essential element in the preparation for the effective use of force.
Back to your open letter to the President, you talk about Hezbollah and the need to reapproach that organizations like that. Tell us more.
Well, Hezbollah is particularly important in all of this because it is Hezbollah and Hamas together that have created the culture of suicide bombing. They have been the ones who have elevated suicide bombing to a glorious martyrdom. By the way, with help from Saddam Hussein, who sends money to the families of suicide bombers. They have elevated suicide bombing to the point where there is now an inexhaustible supply of suicide bombers. All of our systems of security are built on the assumption that people out to attack us do not themselves wish to die. So we have to go after the terrorist organizations that are creating and sustaining this culture. They are at the very core of the challenge that faces us.
We'll get to calls just a second for Richard Perle. USA Today, Pat Buchanan wrote on Thursday, "Whose war is this?" Photo of Richard Perle there and Colin Powell. "Course of war will depend on which group of advisors wins Bush's ear." What'd you make of what Mr. Buchanan had to say?
Well, like everything Pat Buchanan has said for years, it's wrong, of course. The differences in attitude toward how we go about this are questions of tactics, questions of strategy, but there are no fundamental differences in this government. And I have unlimited confidence in this regard in the President of the United States. He seems to me to have a very clear grasp of what is necessary. It was all laid out rather eloquently in his speech to the joint session of Congress. He is going to go after countries that support terrorism, countries that harbor terrorists, and the terrorists themselves. That's the policy. I don't think there's a debate about that.
And you're actively advising the President as part of a group right now?
No, I advise from time to time the Secretary of Defense and others who have time to listen.
Let's go to New Orleans for Richard Perle. Good morning.
Good morning.
Go right ahead.
I live currently in New Orleans, Louisiana, but originally I'm citizen of Azerbaijan. That's one of former Soviet Union republics. And I have 2 questions. But first of all, I want to express that people of Azerbaijan support United States. I want to express condolences. And Azerbaijan itself has experienced suffered a lot from terrorism. We had 3 times subway stations in our capital were blown up by terrorists and several hundred people died. So that's the point I want to bring. That I think Mr. President Bush was very right in pointing out that the war on terrorism, not on any specific nation, not on Islamic nations, not on any religion at all. And a lot of other terrorist groups besides Muslim terrorist groups. I understand that Muslim terrorist groups are primary enemy, and I support U.S. at first. It had the people who perpetrated acts in New York and Washington need to be punished. But I think it will be good for U.S. if after that, all countries which harbor terrorism, and I want to bring a point that, for example, Armenian terrorists has been targeting Turkish diplomats for decades, and a lot of them now live freely in Armenia. So that's what I think. If U.S. goes and puts pressure on every country, that will win support.
Let's get a response from our guest.
Well, the war against terror cannot be one in which we pick and choose. There will, from time to time, be local terrorist organizations, and it is beyond our capacity to deal individually and effectively with every one of them. What is necessary is to change the climate in which states support terror, and terror is regarded as an instrument of policy. And that can be accomplished, in my view, if we are successful in eradicating the principal groups that are engaged in terror and in raising the costs to the states that support terrorism to the point where they simply decide it is no longer worth it.
You mentioned military action in Afghanistan, perhaps Iraq. Any other parts of the world as part of this campaign?
Well, we know the countries that have been involved in terrorism. Iran is involved, Syria is involved. There are parts of Lebanon, principally under Syrian control, that are bases for terror. Sudan has been involved in terror, Yemen, Somalia, North Korea. I don't think that it is going to be necessary to deal with each and every one of them as long as we are effective and decisive in dealing with one or two. For example, if Saddam Hussein is destroyed as a result of his support of terror, that will send a message that will not be ignored by the Syrian president, that will not be ignored by the leadership in Iran. Up until now, there has been no cost attached to supporting terrorist organizations. When we responded at all, and frequently the responses were feeble, pathetic, but when we responded at all, it was against the terrorists themselves, and the countries that supported them pretty much got off scot-free. If we make it easy to support terror, if we make it cheap, we will find terrorists get a lot of support. If we make it costly, prohibitively expensive, I think we'll see a very sharp decline in the sanctuary, the logistics, the communications, the intelligence, and the money on which terrorists depend.
We have a call for Richard Perle from London. Hello.
Yeah, hi. I'm an Indian citizen calling from London. I was just listening to your program. Thanks for the program. Just a question. India has been dealing with terrorism for like past 2 decades, and I'm glad that the world is realizing how the terror strikes everyone. And I just have a question for your guest. And when he says that you should go after, because there are supposedly like 60 countries that support terror around the world. Now, how do you plan to tackle? You can't bomb every one of them. And if you start bombing, particularly Muslim countries, you're talking about 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. Are we planning to kill every one of them?
Something we sort of touched on in the last answer.
No, of course we're not planning to kill Muslims. Muslims are not targets of this campaign. The targets of this campaign are terrorists and the leadership in the governments that support them. And it's not 1.2 billion Muslims by any means. It's actually a very small number of people. And the way to go about this is to change some of these governments. Because above all else, the Saddam Husseins of the world, the Taliban leadership, for example, Mullah Omar, above all, they value their grip on power, their rule. And when that rule is challenged, they will have to consider whether it was wise for them to support terrorism in the first place.
I get a lot of calls on this program with different opinions as to why this happened or why this happens. Religious, political, economic, cultural. What do you think? What's your make of it?
Well, there are a great many motives involved, from the motives of the individual suicide bomber who's prepared to surrender his life in order to inflict injury, to the calculating actions of the governments that support them. When Saddam Hussein supports terror, it is in large measure aimed at vengeance. It's simply destroying Americans because we defeated his ambitions when he invaded Kuwait and stand in the way of the hegemony in the region that he desires. So there's a whole range of motives. I do not believe that that fundamental to this is some battle between Islam and the non-Islamic world. I think that most of the Islamic world wishes to live in peace and are as horrified as we are at what has happened.
What's the significance of the UN action on Friday, its resolution requiring member nations to fight terrorism?
I think that's a good thing. But UN resolutions, as we've seen in the past, amount to little unless they are enforced somehow. No one is obligated to respond to a UN resolution. And Iraq is a member of the UN. Are they going to respond to this? I rather doubt it. So it's very well as far as it goes, but it's only the beginning.
Longview, Texas, for Richard Perle. Good morning.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. How you doing, Richard Perle?
Very well, thanks.
Yeah, I have a quick comment for you. I feel that the people of Iraq and Afghanistan have been misled and somewhat deceived about the USA. In some respects, I feel that they've been brainwashed and deceived and misled about our country of peace, truth, liberty, and justice. What a better cause and virtue. Sure, we don't want to see innocent people die abroad in the Middle East, but having said that, though, that's a tragedy in itself, or if I may say, conflict. When you can't reason with radical people or proponents of terrorism, it's the only alternative, I feel, unfortunately. And I'd just like to get your brief comment on that.
Thank you.
Well, our problem, of course, is not with the people of Iraq, or for that matter, the people of Afghanistan. It is with a leadership that imposes its will on those people and uses the same techniques of brutality and terror that in their external manifestation lead to things like attacks on the World Trade Center. Our problem is with a small number of people who, for their own reasons, support terrorism, recruit terrorists, provide the money, the intelligence, the communications, the logistics, the tradecraft, and all of the other things that make it possible for some seriously misled, brainwashed young men to destroy themselves in order to destroy others. That has to be the focus of our attention.
While we have you here, Richard Perle, get your thought on some of the headlines we've been reading here in Washington. In the Post here, bin Laden's location sketchy. Apparently, U.S. getting conflicting intelligence reports. Some suggest he may have slipped out into Somalia, Chechnya, or Pakistan. Others think he is still in Afghanistan. Intelligence problems there.
Sure, it's very difficult to find an individual, but it isn't essential to find an individual, in my view. If Osama bin Laden, in order to save his own skin, and he's not committing suicide, by the way. The leadership of these movements and the state sponsors are not suicidal themselves. They're quite prepared to induce others to commit suicide. But if Osama bin Laden, in order to save his own skin, is forced to hide in a cave somewhere in Afghanistan or elsewhere, we will have achieved a major victory. Because up until now, he hasn't been hiding in caves. He's been sitting in offices plotting the destruction of innocent civilians. His ability to do that will be radically reduced if he's on the run, if he's a hunted man. And that is probably the most we can hope to accomplish, not only with bin Laden, but with others. If we can drive the terrorists into a situation where most of their energy goes to staying alive themselves because they are being hunted down, we will effectively win this war against terror.
So that would involve, would it not, a sustained military campaign in that part of the world, perhaps in Afghanistan, to keep him running, as you put?
We're going to need a sustained campaign. The best way to shorten this campaign would be to change the governments that are now harboring him. If you had a government in Afghanistan that was opposed to terror, they would make life very difficult for bin Laden.
How does the U.S. have a sustained campaign and continue to win the support of other countries, particularly in that part of the world, as time goes on?
Well, I think as time goes on and as we demonstrate that our objective is a vicious leadership that has no broad-based support anywhere, there will be tolerance for what we're doing. In any case, whether we have support or not, we have to do what we must do to defend ourselves. It is a great mistake to think that we will defend ourselves by signing up a long list of countries who say they support us. Those who truly support us will be with us until the end, and those who are induced simply to say so are of little use in any case. But we were attacked, not others. We must defend ourselves.
Jacksonville, Florida, for Richard Perle. Good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Perle, I read a little bit about your letter that you and your band of neoconservatives has sent to our president, and I'm certainly hoping that Mr. Colin Powell's side wins out in this schism that seems to be developing. We've already expended a lot of treasure of this nation defending the Israelis, and it seems to me that your side, instead of just trying to attack the terrorists who attack this country, also wants to put a little hurt on Israelis' enemies too, and I'd just soon leave them alone right now. We've already created enough ill will in that part of the country.
All right, thank you. And there's the section of your letter, the open letter, Richard Perle, Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Tell us more specifically about what you think should happen there, and then respond to the caller.
Well, clearly, we are dealing with a network of terror, and it is absurd to try to distinguish between the suicide bombers who attack teenagers at a discotheque in Tel Aviv and the same culture of suicide bombing that is organized to attack the World Trade Center and kill Americans. I don't know what this caller thinks. Does he believe that we would not be attacked if we stopped associating ourselves with the only democracy in the Middle East? It is very dangerous indeed to take the attitude this gentleman has taken, because what it says to the terrorists around the world is, if you want to do damage to Israel, and many of them do, attack the United States, and the United States will abandon Israel. And if the network of terror we're dealing with comes to the conclusion that the quickest way to achieve their objectives with respect to Israel is to attack the heartland of the United States, we will be subjected as the Israelis have been subjected not to the occasional terrorist act, but to chronic terrorism.
A lot of callers this morning, Richard Perle, didn't so much say abandon Israel, but take a more balanced approach.
I think our approach is entirely balanced now. We have involved ourselves over many years in an effort to bring about a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I don't see how that can be characterized as unbalanced. And it was about the time this trade center bombing was being plotted, as the plans were being drawn up. That happens to have been a moment when the United States was deeply involved in encouraging negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and we were a hero in the Arab world at that point. So it's a great mistake to think that we will enhance our security by diminishing our ties with Israel.
Back to the phones for Richard Perle. A little bit more than a half hour left in this segment. Mission Viejo, California. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Richard. First,
Morning.
thank you for taking my call. I just want to say one thing, that if you look at the superpowers throughout the history, definitely this country has done a lot more good to the world than did harm. And the sad thing about it is we are very, very weak in spreading this message to the world. We don't try to show that we really mean good to the world. Now, one of the things that really upset me is we have to go after bin Laden, we have to go after his terrorist network. But I'm a little bit afraid, that we might be perceived as arrogant by saying, if you're not with us, you're against us. We should try to give some legitimacy to our fight against terrorism after we get rid of bin Laden, and try to get the UN or some international body involved on our side, just to, ease our picture as an arrogant superpower.
Thanks, Richard Perle.
Well, if it is arrogant to defend oneself against attacks on our civilian population, then we will be arrogant. I really think that's a misplaced emphasis. We were not attacked because we are arrogant. We were attacked because there are people who wish to destroy our way of life and what we represent. And what we represent is the Western tradition of liberal democracy, and the people who wish to destroy us represent an entirely different way of life. Arrogant, unarrogant, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we are successful and effective. What matters is that when we are attacked, we respond. And when we are attacked massively, we respond massively.
As we talk about the UN here, a couple of times we'll point out that tomorrow on C-SPAN 9:45, we will show you a UN General Assembly meeting on terrorism. New York's Mayor Rudy Giuliani will speak, as well as Secretary General Kofi Annan and the U.S. Ambassador John Negroponte. That will be preceded by this program, the Washington Journal, where we will talk with Admiral Stansfield Turner, former CIA director, as well as Laura Murphy of the ACLU. Caller from Spain this morning. Hello.
Yes, this is Ed Macher calling from Menorca.
Mm-hmm.
President Bush is willing to shoot down a hijacked airliner to sacrifice some lives to save a few, save more. The bombers, the suicide bombers, their families are getting health benefits, schooling for their children, and his act is being glorified in a shrine.
Want to respond to that?
Yes, if Israel is knocking down the homes of the families that the suicide bomber comes from. If they do it with the families inside, you will see how fast suicide bombing stops.
Want to speak to that, Richard Perle?
Well, I think we should be dealing with the culture of suicide bombing and its location, which we all know is in the West Bank and Gaza. That is now the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority, and they have failed utterly to achieve control over their own territory. There are parades in Gaza, parades in the West Bank, in which suicide bombers are celebrated, venerated, made into heroes. On any Friday in the mosques in those places, you will hear a call for suicide bombers. I have seen videotapes of Yasser Arafat calling for suicide bombing. We have to come to grips with this. We can't pretend it isn't there. And that means insisting, demanding that the Palestinian Authority bring this culture of suicide bombing to an end.
New York Times, some experts say U.S. is vulnerable to a germ attack. Been hearing a lot about that, chemical or biological weapons. Speak to that if you could.
Well, I think that danger, which cannot be excluded, is sometimes overblown. It is not easy to administer either chemical or biological weapons. We have some, not perfect, but some defenses in place against them. The materials are not easy to come by. But there are dangers there, and it is one of the reasons why it is vital that we recognize that this war against terror is much bigger than the war against Osama bin Laden. The ability to deliver chemical and biological weapons, perhaps more than other dangerous weapons, depends on state sponsorship. And by the way, nuclear weapons will not be far behind. And the states that sponsor terrorism are precisely the states that have programs aimed at producing chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons.
How much would you be concerned, if at all, about a germ or a chemical attack against actual troops in Afghanistan?
Well, it's a real concern, and we have, in the past, equipped our troops to the degree that we can, and we can do quite a lot to protect them against those hazards. We've had programs in place for a long time to do that, but nobody can say that it is without risk.
Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for Richard Perle. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Perle.
Good morning.
I have one comment and one is a small question. The terrorism is not the only way of Islamic way of life. If you look in Ireland, it's still today. You look in South India, the Tamils blowing up the Sri Lankans every day. In Punjab, Sikhs are, this is the political motivation, okay? Look at your former Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin. He blew up the King David Hotel and killed so many Britishers and so many Arabs and all. This has nothing to do with the way of Islam. This is all, political. If they want to gain some sanctuary or country or recognition, they do it. My question is, those countries who do not abide the United Nations resolutions, whether the United Nations or America put the sanction on them, embargo on them, or attack or take those countries, put their own leaders. Why, since 1967, Israel enjoying, denying any resolutions, not following any resolutions, and instead of United Nations or American government sanction on them, they're giving more arms, $3 billion every year. Is there any double policy here? I mean, if some leaders come up and say, hey, what's going on? Why you attack one country? Because, oh, yeah, you're not following United Nations. United Nations says, follow this. Why is this 242 never, applied in Israel?
Thank you, Richard Perle.
Well, the Israelis have long ago accepted UN resolutions 242 and 338, so the premise of the question is just simply wrong. The caller doesn't know what he's talking about. But the idea that one should equate Israel's political stance and its diplomatic posture in complicated negotiations with states supporting terrorism is absurd in my view. I don't know anyone who has accused Israel of engaging in acts of terror or supporting acts of terror.
Santa Ana, California.
Yes, good morning, C-SPAN.
Morning.
Thank you for... I just want to say that even though I didn't vote for George W. Bush, but I really support what he's doing right now. He's doing a good job. I think we need to stand behind the president. It's pretty sad to see that the country is just kind of tripping apart with a whole bunch of people protesting, against terrorism and all that. And one last comment is that we have to, strengthen our border. We have like a, liberal immigration law, people coming over here with visa, students, and you never know what kind of people are getting over here. The next wave will probably be the Chinese. They're coming over here and they're gonna, bomb embassies and et cetera. Because we gotta control who's we letting in here. It's crazy.
Thanks. Immigration concerns there.
Yeah, let me just say first that one of the glories of our democratic system is that if you vote wrong in the first term, you've got a chance to correct that the second time around. So think about that at the next presidential election. With respect to immigration, this country is the remarkable country it is, beacon to the world because we have been an open society, because we are free at home, and we have made our country available to millions of people who wish to come here. They are a great source of our strength, and it would be a tragedy if we were to close our borders. Surely we should be more careful in scrutinizing people who are permitted to come here, and in particular people who are permitted to come here on a temporary basis. So I don't believe there's an inconsistency between remaining the open society that we are and benefiting as we do from the inflow of people from all over the world and protecting our security.
Lead editorial in the Washington Post today touches on the protests from here in Washington and writes, the protesters' arguments deserve to be taken seriously. Many of us would wish that the pacifists were right, that this problem could be solved without more killing, and such wishfulness is likely to translate into more skepticism about a war on terrorism as the war gets tougher. The case for force they are making here. All of the cautions cannot be allowed to obscure the ultimate goal. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said that victory in this struggle will come when Americans are no longer fearful. Children will have to go off to school, and we have to be reasonable expectation that they'll be coming home from school, the Secretary said. But there's a much more measurable and therefore maybe even more difficult objective which the President set and the country must stick to, that no government be permitted to harbor or support international terrorist networks that seek to do Americans harm. That goal can't be achieved without force and the threat of force, much as everyone would wish otherwise. Foreign aid and better understanding among peoples, lovely as both are, won't by themselves get the job done. The lead editorial in the Washington Post. And we have a call for Richard Perle from San Diego. Good morning.
Good morning, Ambassador Perle. I'm calling, I heard what you had said, and I'm calling from San Diego, a 30-minute trolley ride from the border with Mexico. I just threw that in at the last minute. What concerns me is that, at least in this part of the country, there's a desensitization to what occurred. I think when the ultimate death toll is whatever figure comes up, it probably will be over 7,000 people. And that was in one day. Now, we went through the Vietnam War, and approximately 60,000 GIs died over a period from roughly 1964 to 73. Here, almost 1/8 of that total from Vietnam was killed in one day. And yet here, people seem to react as if what they saw on TV was a movie, like the Towering Inferno. There's a bit of an all-too quickness to kind of put it out of the mind. So that, yes, I believe it's good to get back to normal, but I think there's a fine line between denial of what happened and getting back to normal. I think that right in the center of things in Washington, D.C. and New York City, where the trauma occurred, yes, I can well imagine the importance of picking up, lives that have been shattered by loss and grief. But in other parts of the country, I really am concerned that there is not the sense of what a catastrophe, how this was perpetrated.
All right, thanks. You agree with that?
Well, I'm not in San Diego. I'm in Washington, where people are, of course, seized with the immediacy of this tragedy and determined to do something about it. I think it's understandable that the shock of an event of this size would take some time fully to penetrate, particularly people who are living at a distance, particularly where the sun shines every day. But I think the reality has been brought home to the American people, and that's reflected in the very strong support that the President has received for a robust policy, the policy he enunciated in his speech to the joint session.
There's been a lot of question about how long that support may or may not last, the high numbers. Does that matter, public opinion, the polls?
I think presidents have a responsibility to act in the best interests of the country, even when they don't have support. When they have support, it's that much easier. I think this time the wellspring of support is deep, it's broad, and it will be sustained. We have to do the right things, and we have to be seen to be winning the war on terrorism. If it looks as though we're failing, if it looks as though our response is inadequate, then I think we will lose support rapidly. But the American people have said to the president, we want to live with a sense of security. We don't want to feel threatened in our daily lives. Help us achieve that security. And as we see governments fall that have been supporting terrorism, as we see terrorists apprehended, the American people will, I think, redouble their support rather than drain it away.
Damascus, Maryland, for Richard Perle. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Perle. How are you, sir?
Good morning.
Good. Firstly, thanks to C-SPAN for providing this forum. Mr. Perle, thinking in a more long-term venue, this terrorism situation, mindset that we're adopting right now is going to be more of a perpetual kind of a thing. There's not going to be I don't believe, a VT day, so to speak. Thinking long-term, do you see this foundation of terrorism, for want of a better phrase, as providing a possibility for a more homogeneous look to governments, generally speaking, long-term? There will always be, of course, religious differences. However, this common ground that has now been provided by terrorism, do you see any positive coming out of that? Thank you very much. And have a good day.
Thanks.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think in the longer term, the democratization of the world is the ultimate defense against terrorism. Democracies do not support terrorism, and well-ordered democratic governments will unite in their efforts to defeat terrorism. And when terrorists have no place to hide, when they have no sanctuary, that will constitute the victory over terrorism. As long as there are places where terrorists can get up in the morning, go to their offices, plot the destruction of civilians, and go home at night and sleep comfortably in their beds, we are going to be threatened by terrorism. When that is no longer possible, because the governments of the world refuse to tolerate terrorism, and those that don't have been changed, then we will achieve a victory.
What do you make about those who may still be in this country and how the government's been responding to that?
Well, I think any terrorist presence in this country, if we are able to find them, we will. If we can't find them, the next best thing is to cut them off from the network that provides them with the things they need to carry out acts of terror, with planning, intelligence, coordination, and all the rest. It's why I keep coming back to the emphasis on going after the infrastructure that supports terrorism. If you have a factory that's turning out terrorists, you can go look for the terrorists, or you can destroy the factory. And we will be far more efficient and effective if we destroy the factory.
Down to our last 15 minutes left with our guest, Richard Perle. We have a call from Windsor, Canada. Go ahead, Windsor.
Yes, I got a question for Mr. Perle here. It's really amusing. How could the U.S. government decide and declare war against bin Laden when this thing just happened, like a day after the incident happened? And same with the Oklahoma bombing. They declare war against the militia right a day after the incident. How could we have so much evidence and so quick? Another thing...
Can you answer that one first?
Well, I think the answer is pretty simple. We have known for a long time that bin Laden is supporting terrorism. We didn't do anything about it. Or we certainly didn't do enough about it. We tolerated it. And instead of taking action in response to past acts of terror that we can associate with bin Laden, we allowed him to continue. It was a terrible mistake. And he was emboldened by the failure of our response. This surely is not a time for recrimination about who dropped the ball, but that the ball was dropped, I don't think there's any question. We simply tolerated a level of terrorist activity emanating from bin Laden and others that we should never have tolerated.
Another point, caller?
I got another question for Mr.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Another one is the U.S. It's really the one. It's trying to dictate and control the whole world. I mean, with the United Nations approval, we're trying to really sanction countries and destroy countries. And we right here in this country, we really, in the United States, we have a terrorist group camps that we really are training these terrorist groups right here in this country to go to terrorize other countries and other nations. And another problem...
I don't know what you're talking about. Do you know what you're talking about?
Pardon me?
I said, I don't know what you're talking about.
We have terrorist camps in the United States that training terrorism from around the countries to go and terrorize countries
I was unaware of that. Do you have the locations?
Another
Maybe
caller.
We can do something about it.
Another caller had mentioned that same point and talked about the School of the Americas.
I don't know what you're talking about. I think it's complete nonsense.
Okay, let's move on to Chicago. Hello.
Yes, it's Robert. I have a comment and then a question. I've just listened to your previous caller. And Mr. Perlman, it's easy for you to get up there, and when somebody tells you about the evidence that, well, the U.S. have trained terrorists and sponsored groups like bin Laden for years, Saddam Hussein, to fight against their own people, and then when it comes back and it haunts them, they declare, well, they shouldn't have did that. It's the same point about who's the biggest creator of terrorism on the history of this planet, and it's the U.S. government. One comment.
Look, I came here to talk about these issues, not to listen to stupid diatribes.
Hello? Let me put it in right quick. If you talk about major terrorists, the United States government has terrorized, it's the biggest terrorist from the Native Americans to the Afro-Americans, and you can't sit up there and say, well, everything that a caller come in about is nonsense. Because
well, I can say that what you're saying is nonsense because it is, and you should be grateful you live in a country where you can go on like that, free of any retribution.
Back to your open letter to the President, Richard Perle. You talk about the U.S. defense budget, and a large increase in defense spending is going to be required from this point forward. Talk to us more.
Well, we have for some time now faced the challenge of rebuilding the American defense establishment after the Cold War, because by and large, the legacy military establishment that we have today was built for the Cold War with an emphasis on confronting the Soviet Union in the center of Europe. It's a heavy force. It's a rather large force. It is not designed to deal with the new threats we face, threats like terrorism and the need to marshal forces for anti-terrorist activity. That is going to mean a significant investment in new technologies and in new ways of prosecuting military conflict. It's going to be expensive to do that, and now I believe, after the events of September 11, there will be a new readiness to recognize the need for that investment if we are going to have an adequate defense in the kinds of conflicts that represent the future, as opposed to the capabilities we have today that are largely reflective of our past needs.
I was going to ask where missile defense fits into all that.
Well, missile defense is part of the defense against weapons of mass destruction, a very important part. The same countries that sponsor terrorism, Iraq and Iran, for example, North Korea, are busy building nuclear weapons. They're busy building ballistic missiles or trying to acquire them elsewhere. And one of these days they will succeed. It's inevitable. If we do not have a defense in place when they do succeed, we will be exposed to very grave danger. So we need to make a start on missile defense.
San Diego, California. Hello.
Hi. Just wanted to kind of touch on the dialogue that I've been hearing about how we're not really... What's America's accountability in this? That's kind of what I wonder. I mean, if
what do you mean accountability?
Accountability as far as it's all about the dollar to me. I mean, if that may be argued yes or no, but it's all about the dollar. And it seems to me that the attacks on America are almost a casualty of capitalism, because we have been going around the world. I'm not an expert, so I can't actually add any specifics, but we've been exacting our influence for the best for America, which I'm glad we've been doing. But
thanks. All about the dollar, Richard.
No,
Perle.
it's not all about the dollar. Of course it isn't all about the dollar. The people who planned the destruction of innocent civilians in the World Trade Center and in the Department of Defense, we're not thinking about dollars. They were not victims of the United States in any sense. The United States in this century has been the single greatest source of benefit for the rest of the world that history has ever seen. The growth and development of the American economy, American generosity internationally, the benefits that the whole world receives from our effectiveness as a society, our values, our culture, the democratization of much of the world under American influence. I don't see how anyone can hold the United States culpable. And I still less understand how anyone could argue that we bear any responsibility for this act against us.
Pueblo, Colorado.
Yes, I have a question and a comment.
Caller, hit the mute button on your set if you could.
Hello?
Can you hit the mute button on your remote?
Yes. I have a question and comment.
Go ahead.
I agree 100% with Mr. Perle's attitude towards cutting off the base of the funding. And I think the cutting off of the funds from Iraq could be accomplished perhaps with the destruction of the infrastructure of his petroleum base, because that's where he gets his money. And I think a second base would be to fund and rearm the Kurds. And that's all I have to say.
Any thoughts?
Well, there is an Iraqi opposition that is broader than just the Kurds, but certainly includes the Kurds. It includes Kurds in the north and Shia in the south, and even Sunni Muslims in the west. I think there is no doubt that we should be energetically supporting the opposition to Saddam Hussein. They should be regarded as freedom fighters. That's what they are. They want to liberate their country from this tyranny. Remember, Saddam has used poison gas against his own people, Kurdish villages, and thousands died. In fact, I think the numbers are comparable to the number that died in the World Trade Center. We've had the option of supporting the opposition for a long time, but we've had a lot of I think weak-kneed diplomats in town who have thought that was too risky. Well, the whole sense of what's risky has to change now, because we see that we are at risk, and in a very fundamental way. The Iraqi National Congress, which is an umbrella group of the opposition to Saddam Hussein, deserves our support. The Congress has voted to support them, and the administration should get off its behind and permit them to organize themselves to contend with Saddam Hussein, who is one of the world's great sponsors of international terrorism.
Go back to Afghanistan and talk to us about the anti-Taliban forces, Northern Alliance, they call them, and how the U.S. should be handling things with that particular group over there.
I think our objective should be to destroy the Taliban regime, which has given sanctuary to Osama bin Laden, and permits camps in which terrorists are trained for the sorts of missions that we saw on September 11 are permitted to operate freely. So the Taliban government is beyond the pale in that regard, and it should be destroyed. And if we can gain the support of others in Afghanistan for that, we should surely do that.
Marshfield, Missouri, for Richard Perle. Good morning.
I only had a comment. I think it's amusing for Perle to sit up there and say bin Laden is hiding in a cave, which he is not. And the first person I saw run and hide in a cave up in Nebraska when the Trade Center was hit was George Bush. And for 24 hours, we never had a president.
Well, I mean, that seems to me the kind of ignorant remark that someone wholly unfamiliar with how the resources of this country are used in a crisis would make. The president's first responsibility is to remain in control of our ability to defend ourselves. And the right thing for the president to do was to be in a place from which he could conduct whatever operations were necessary to defend this country. I don't know what the caller thinks he should have done.
What do you think about the role of Russia and China in all this?
Well, I think the Russians have their own reasons for wanting to deal with terrorism. So do the Chinese, for that matter. The whole world has a reason to deplore and despise terrorism. So I have no doubt that they will do those things that they believe to be in their own interest. The idea, which one sometimes hears, that we should be making concessions to the Russians or the Chinese in order to induce them to do what they would be doing in their own interest, seems to me quite silly.
Time for a couple more calls for our guest. Atlanta, thank you for waiting. Good morning.
Yeah, hi. A couple of comments. First of all, I think it's very dangerous, again, to separate why these attacks took place without considering, again, United States support of Israel to the detriment of the Palestinians, and also the fact that it is based on dollars. Do you really think that we would have gone in and protected Kuwait if we weren't trying to prevent Saddam Hussein, from controlling 25% of the oil in the world, and thus eliminating our God-given right to have $1 per gallon gasoline?
What do you think, Richard Perle?
Well, it's a long time since we had $1 per gallon gasoline. We opposed Saddam Hussein because Saddam Hussein invaded another country brutally. Had he been permitted to succeed in that, other countries would have fallen to Saddam Hussein. And we need to learn the lessons of history. The lessons of history are when you allow aggression to take place without opposition, you get more aggression.
Newton, New Jersey, our next call. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I agree with the comment that we should learn lessons of history. The early history with the Taliban was that we supported the Taliban movement partly because we wanted to support UNICAL's effort to build a pipeline through Afghanistan. And in so doing, we essentially we put ourselves in the hands of the devil. And I feel like that if we continue to support these kinds of economic interests rather than supporting our foreign aid effort, for example, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which only gets 1/10 or less than 1/10 of 1% of the U.S. budget, that we will continue to spawn more Talibans.
Richard Perle.
Well, I think the idea that we are spawning Taliban regimes, maniacal regimes, because we're not giving enough aid is ridiculous. The fact is we are the single largest contributor of humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan. The idea that this country designs its diplomatic and political activities to support the interests of an oil company is one of the great myths that your caller obviously accepts uncritically. We did support the opposition to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. We did that in the context of the Cold War, and we were quite right to do that. There was, after the Cold War, after the withdrawal of the Soviet Union, an internal struggle over power, and unfortunately the wrong people came to the top. And so we're now faced with a government that supports terrorism. But the idea that this is the product of our promoting the interests of UNICAL or any other company is just silly.
Last call for our guest. Another call from London. Welcome.
Yes, it's a comment. I'd like Mr. Perle to comment on the following. While I understand your State Department wishes to include both Syria and Iran in this coalition, don't you think to attempt to bring them into this coalition is a policy that's seriously flawed in the light of the fact that these two countries support state terrorism?
Yes, I agree entirely. I don't believe, by the way, that the Department of State wishes to bring Iran and other states supporting terrorism into the coalition. I noticed that the British Foreign Secretary made an unsuccessful visit to Tehran, in which he told the Iranian leadership how proud he was of having suppressed an anti-Iranian terror group operating in the United Kingdom, and they, as he tells it, then said to him, He asked them to do the same to suppress Hezbollah and Hamas, and of course he came home empty-handed. It was an absurd mission. We will not succeed in the war against terror if we reach out to states supporting terror and ask them to help us. They're not going to help us, and we will only corrupt our own position and deprive ourselves of the moral high ground if we chase terrorist states to fight against terrorism.
We say thanks to Richard Perle, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
And thanks to everybody who phoned in. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of this program, 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Among our guests, Stansfield Turner, the former CIA director, and Laura Murphy of the American Civil Liberties Union. Journal starts every day, 7 a.m. Eastern Time, 4 o'clock Pacific here on C-SPAN. Enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend, and we'll see you tomorrow.